Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kyle Levy. I'm a professor of history and co-director of the Lytton Center for History and the Public Good here at Ohlone College. We're really excited to present our next speaker event today, Daniel Summerhill, and my fellow co-director, Dr. Catherine Michael, will introduce him in just a moment. Before we get started, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to share our mission and then talk to you a little bit about how you can get engaged and involved with the talk as we're going. First, to share our mission. The Lytton Center considers ways that the study of the past can help shape the present and the future. Our mission is to inspire the Ohlone community to work for the public good through programming focused on access, equity, inclusion, justice, and service. The Lytton Center explores challenges facing our community and the world, past, present, and future, and fosters big ideas that will inspire and transform Ohlone and the larger community for the better. Through training, programming, and capacity building, the Lytton Center empowers students to advocate for a just and equitable world. Today, we're very lucky to have Daniel Summerhill joining us to share his work and his wisdom. Please stay engaged with the talk as we're going by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions and make comments while the talk is going and after during our Q&A session with the speaker. I'm going to hand things over to my fellow co-director, Dr. Catherine Michael, who will introduce Daniel Summerhill.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you everyone for being here today. So as Kyle said, I'm going to be introducing our wonderful speaker. Daniel B. Summerhill is a poet and essayist who has earned fellowships from Baldwin for the Arts and The Watering Hole. He is the inaugural Poet Laureate of Monterey County and has published 2 collections of poems. The first is Divine, Divine, Divine in 2021, and the second is Mausoleum of Flowers in 2022. His poems and essays appear in the Progressive, Columbia Journal, Obsidian, The Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. An Oakland native, Daniel lives in the Bay Area and is assistant professor of poetry at Santa Clara University. So please join us in welcoming him. Daniel, I'll hand it over to you.
Cool. Thanks so much, Kyle, Catherine, for the introductions, for the invitation to speak, and for all of the work in hosting these series of events. I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of the poet's duty. And I'm going to do so by standing on the shoulders of some of the folks who I admire, poets, writers, essayists, who have instructed me, inspired me, taught me. And speaking of inspiration, I sometimes like to begin like talks by thinking or I guess explaining how I became a poet and kind of where the inspiration came from. So James Baldwin, who I'll mention quite a bit today, I like to think of as like an uncle, or ironically, he has a nephew named Daniel. So James Baldwin is a writer, poet, thinker, activist, and he really inspired me to kind of dig deeper, to empathize, to think about the world through kind of a poetic lens. And he says, no one becomes a writer, but you discover you are one. And once you do, you're going to do that or you're going to do nothing else. And so I like to think that I was born a writer, but there were 2 events or 2 folks that kind of helped bring that realization to fruition. The first is my sister, my oldest sister. Her name is Tanisha Smith. She is also a poet. And I have 3 older sisters, no brothers, and I'm the youngest. And so I was in the 7th or 8th grade, and she had just gotten married to her then husband and was moving away to New York, where he was from. We lived in the Bay Area. I grew up in Oakland. So she was moving away, and I was heartbroken. Of course, we were the closest of my sisters. And so she left behind this photo album of poetry that she wrote while she was in high school. And within that poem, or the photo album, was a poem called Wishing Upon a 747. And I still remember it like vividly to this day. The poem in essence is her realization that she was not wishing upon a shooting star, but rather a jet airplane, because stars aren't visible from the inner city, most inner cities, because of light pollution. And so coming to that as this fledgling 11-year-old boy, body changing, mind changing, trying to figure out who I am, what I want to do, what I'm interested in. That was a part of the catalyst, I like to think, for me exploring words in that way, right? The other person who I think is kind of largely responsible for me becoming a poet is in the 9th grade. I had a teacher, English teacher named Mr. Ross, Justin Ross, Albany High School. And so we had a unit on poetry. So we got to read poems, write poems, and share our poems. So we did that. I wrote some poems and shared them with the class. The very next day, Mr. Ross pulled me aside after class, and he gave me two things. He gave me a notebook or a journal, and that he wrote inside the cover, "So much talent, never wasted." And then he gave me a book, the first novel I ever read from cover to cover, called The White Boy Shuffle by Paul Beatty. Small gestures, right? But it was Mr. Ross, deciding, hey, there might be something here with this kid in words. And so I'm going to take the time, spend a few bucks to get him a journal in this novel in hopes that that will be a spark, right? Or, some sort of vector to kind of push him or nudge him along on his journey towards being a writer, perhaps, right? Lo and behold, here I am, right? A professor of poetry, written some stuff, right? I love poetry. I love teaching poetry. I love talking about poetry, nerding out about poetry. And again, it was the small gesture of folks like Mr. Ross. So shout out to teachers and the folks that take the time to nudge, the fledglings on their way, right? Or that see a little slither, within someone and decide to kind of nudge or push them along on their journey, because it means, I think, a great deal. Okay, so those two folks, again, kind of were the spark, right? However, even before that, if you rewind, even before that, my thought or my theory is that I'm a poet because my grandfather was a carpenter. In fact, I think of poetry as another way of using your hands, right? Of making something out of nothing, right? Out of figuring out the kind of best materials to use to compose a thing. Yesterday, Santa Clara University hosted poet David Baker. And at the end of his talk, he mentioned, throughout the talk, actually, he mentioned Emily Dickinson and his fascination with Emily Dickinson, admiration of Emily Dickinson. And he mentioned that a lot of Emily Dickinson's poems and work was written on available material, right? So if there was an envelope nearby, a scrap piece of paper, right, that Dickinson wanted to use or, needed to get something down on, she'd grab it. And so a lot of the poems, the line breaks are like jagged or, weird looking, right? There's breaks on like between words, etc. And the reason is because she ran out of space, right? So if the envelope is only, yay wide, then that's as wide as the line can go. Anyways, the short of that is Emily Dickinson really grabbed a hold of the idea of using the available material. So the last little story I'll share before I jump into like the minutia of the talk is my grandfather, like I said, was a carpenter, and I would ask him to build me go-karts every summer. This is as I was a little boy. So I was 6, 7, 8, 9, around those ages. Ask him, Grandpa, build me a go-kart, please. I really want this go-kart. Of course, he's really busy, building stuff, sanding floors, constructing houses, doing remodels, et cetera, et cetera. And so one summer, I think I was about 8 years old or so, he says, you want a go-kart? Okay, but you're going to build it. So he says, you see that 2x4 leaning against the house? Go grab it. So I went and grabbed the 2x4. He says, go grab that milk carton, inside the garage. So I grabbed not the milk carton, but the milk crate, the little green crates, square crates. So I grabbed the crate. He says, go get the shopping cart that's sitting in the gutter, roll it back over here. So I went and got the shopping cart. Then he says, go get your least favorite pair of shoes. And so I did. I think there were maybe like some Shacks. Back in the day, there were like Shack shoes that looked like Air Force Ones. So I got those beat up Shack shoes. He said, okay, here's what we're gonna do. Chop that 2x4 into 3 parts. You're gonna have your center kind of axle or bar, and then you're gonna have the front and the rear axle. Right. So I chopped that, we chopped those in half or in the thirds and, built the framing. He said, take the wheels off the shopping cart, slap those on the sides of the front and rear axle. So we did that. He says, okay, cut the front off of the milk crate. And so I did that, cut the front off the milk crate, set it on the back of the cross section. And then he says, take the shoestrings out of those Shack shoes, those least favorite pair of shoes. And so I did that. And he said, attach them to the front axle. That's how you're going to steer. And I said, Grandpa, this is really uncomfortable, as I said on the milk crate. He said, okay, fine, go figure that out, right? He didn't say, here's a solution. He said, go figure it out. So I, went inside and found a pillow, set the pillow inside the milk crate, problem solved. So I sit in the go-kart and I'm, holding the shoestrings. He says, and I say, but Grandpa, I'm not moving, right? It's flat. There's no propulsion, there's no engine on this thing. And this is where, where we lived was, flat. He says, okay, toss it in the back of my truck. So we do so. And then we go to this big hill in Oakland and he lets me ride down the hill. Why is that important? Why do I share that? I think in large part, that was my introduction to poetic craft. That was my introduction to figuring out how to use, as Emily Dickinson did, the available materials. And I like to think about poetry, the art of poetry, as merely that, of using your hands and using the available materials at your disposal, right? Okay, keep that in mind and in the back of your head as I kind of move through this. So I'll begin by sharing a story about my trip to South Africa. In 2018, I was invited by the U.S. Embassy to travel to Durban, which is the kind of the east, the very bottom, but east kind of coast of Africa, as a part of the International Poetry Africa Festival, a festival that brought to the country poets from all over the world: Canada, Belgium, England, Botswana, Nigeria, Spain, and a bunch of other countries. I spent much of my time when I was not teaching or enjoying the amazing food, walking with poets along the Southern Ocean, which is an amazing sight and thing to experience, by the way. At the bottom of the earth, which is kind of where this is, the sun is loud, right? Meaning it's huge. In the mornings, it rises out of the ocean and claims the entire sky for like 30 minutes. So anyways, one afternoon, I took a walk with a poet named Pina Kope, who was considered the Maya Angelou of South Africa. We talked about many things concerning life, poetry, and what has sustained her as a writer for well over 30, 40 years. When I asked her why she wrote poems, she responded by saying, "What other way to praise God?" Now, one way to interpret this on its face, especially since South Africa is heavily colonized, and Western religious practices are still very prevalent there. So you can kind of take that on its face, right? However, what I gathered from our talk and her response is that God represented some sort of truth, the only truth, the only absolute, the only thing a writer can be after. This being or not that some of us subscribe to is something we cannot conceive of, right? This idea of God. But it dictates our lives, our thoughts, our salvation, often. And to be a Christian, right, in some ways is to be in search of God, right? I know I grew up a Christian, I was raised in the church, but for Pina Kope, this also meant writing as an exercise of always being in search of some truth, right? Or being after the truth. All right, now I want to ground this a little bit. I'm going to read an excerpt from a book called Social Poetics by Mark Nowak. Langston Hughes, no doubt reflecting on his own wide-ranging political activities in and beyond the Jim Crow America during the first half of the 20th century, once described what he felt to be a central difference between the social poet and those poets who were more exclusively concerned with aesthetics and craft. I have never known the police of any country to show interest in lyric poetry as such. But when poems start talking about the moon, stop talking about the moon, and begin to mention poverty, trade unions, color lines, and colonies, somebody tells the police. Hughes' crucial essay published in W.E.B. Du Bois' Philon magazine in 1947 is titled My Adventures as a Social Poet. Hughes describes his early poems as social poems because they were about people's problems, whole groups of people's problems, rather than their own personal difficulties. And as he reminds readers in his essay, the moon belongs to everybody, but not this America Earth of ours, right? That is perhaps why poems about the moon perturb to no one, but poems about color and poverty do perturb many citizens. Social forces pulling backwards or forwards or right or left, and social poems get caught in the pulling and hauling, and the poet himself sometimes gets pulled, even hauled off to jail. In fact, there are many numerous examples of poets being subject to persecution for telling the truth. The Nigerian-American poet Chris Abani's work chronicles his time while imprisoned, thanks to his writing about a corrupt government in Nigeria. Allen Ginsberg's Howl got him into a great deal of trouble, right? And Across the Water, when Joseph Stalin rose to power, one of his first acts was killing off all the poets in a night, which is now referred to as the Night of the Murdered Poets, because he understood the poetry is a truth-telling profession. It's a truth-telling kind of thing to do. And of course, that was a threat. And so he decided the easiest way to eradicate, right, the truth is to kill them, right? So again, writers in the lineage and the history of the world, right, have been subject to this kind of persecution due to speaking up and telling the truth. Right. So what Langston Hughes is arguing for is the practice of writing the chronicle and to make aware the conditions of the people meaning the collective, not the individual or the writer solely considered with aesthetics for aesthetics' sake, right? Not just concerned with the beauty, right, of the poem or the beauty of the moon, right? But rather, what are we after by really, chronicling, right, and observing the world? So here's the thesis, right, of this thing. And if there's writers listening, this is especially for you. For everyone else, this is, consider it like a banquet in which the awardee is being celebrated and everybody else is there for the food. This is the food for the rest of everyone. And for the writers, I'm talking to you here. You have a duty as a writer, especially as a poet, whether you consciously choose to fulfill it or not, it exists. You have this duty because you decided to be a writer, someone dedicated to keeping, wrestling with, and pushing language. Language being the most important asset we have as human beings. Why? Because it is how we know we exist, how we know we are alive. Our only way of translating information, triumphs, and struggles. Without language, we have no way of describing self-awareness and no way of metacognition. And therefore, if you are a writer, your duty is to tell the truth, because without telling the truth, we die. And I mean that in both a figurative and a literal sense. You are self-preserving when you write and when you tell the truth. Writing, languaging is self-preservation. Poetry, nonfiction, and yes, even fiction is rooted in the truth. Writing is about the truth, and that is the responsibility. Before I began teaching at Santa Clara University, I taught at California State University, Monterey Bay in the Creative Writing and Social Action Program, which is the only one in the country. The Creative Writing Social Action Program is the only one in the country that has a social action piece like embedded into the curriculum. So one semester, on the second day of classes, a student tells me she wrote a poem in order to change the world. And I tell her that's asking a hell of a lot of a poem. This student was not present on day one of class when I began, as I do all of my poetry classes, by saying the poem is not enough. But telling the truth might lead to some collective shift in consciousness or some sort of global change or mind. And then humans as an organism, right, as a singular kind of organism, might pivot from such infraction. So we, again, as an organism, right, a singular organism, only have instances of the cancer being a microcosm of something on the macro level, which is related usually to colonization or mass incarceration or global pandemics and so on and so forth. And so the poet's job is to tell the truth in hopes that that image, that metaphor, that poem might help shift the kind of collective consciousness into a place of righteousness. And then once the poem does, the poet shouldn't be celebrated, nor should the poem, right? The poet is merely a cell within the organism working on behalf of the whole, just like anybody else, just like a grocery store clerk, right? Or a lawyer, or a teacher, right? They're all part of the larger organism and working on behalf of the collective, right? So as poets, the obligation is to tell the truth. Now, I realize that sounds really romantic or like grandiose. So to clarify, what I mean is not that poets are somehow oracles with all the answers. To the contrary, poets don't have all the answers, but it is their moral, and I'd argue professional duty, to be in constant quest towards some truth. So it should be of no shock when I say that the poem is not enough, right? The poem is not enough. Okay. And I know folks might be sitting there wondering, like, okay, so what is this truth this guy keeps, mentioning or speaking about? And that's not to say that, again, poets are the oracles or have all the answers, right? That's not what I'm arguing for. Instead, James Baldwin says we don't always know what the truth is, right? But we do know what a lie is. And in the United States, James Baldwin argues most lies are derivatives of America's original sin. As Baldwin says, a lie can only lead to more lies. So our current economic, social, global, political, and cultural phenomenons, especially in the United States and in the larger Western world, originate from this original sin. And that original sin, as James Baldwin articulates in several texts, including No Name in the Street, The Fire Next Time, and then James Claude or Eddie Claude's Begin Again. He says, James Baldwin, that the original lie is that when folks came to this country, when it was being colonized, they can recognize a man as a man, but they decided to call him anything but a man, right? And so all of our current issues, the lineage of our issues stem from that lie, James Baldwin argues, right? And so James Baldwin's work is an attempt to unpack, combat, and wrestle with that original sin or that original lie, right? So what an exciting and terrifying thing writing is, right? Nobody in their right mind would choose to be a writer, Baldwin says. In a lower division writing course, I'll share one more quick story. In the lower division writing course, a student stayed behind and asked me, Professor Summerhill, how did you know you wanted to be a writer? Or how did you know you wanted to be a poet? And, I gave my most condensed answer, which included my sister and Justin Ross, my teacher, Justin Ross. And so I gave that response, and she says, well, I'm not sure if I want to be a writer, or I'm not sure if I want to be a poet. And mind you, this student is really good poet. I don't know if I want to be a poet. And I say, why? She says, because, well, when I write, sometimes it scares me. And I chuckled a little bit, sat back, in my chair, and I said, my dear, it is too late, right? Keith Layman says, the struggle in and of itself has meaning. The great Toni Morrison says, the only way to avoid the hand of God is to get in it. James Baldwin says, if you're scared of death, walk towards it, right? So writing, especially confronting, forces you to confront things about yourself, right? Which is this act of truth telling, right? So writing is no revolutionary act, right? But telling the truth is the craft of truth telling and excavation, and through the mundane, through the people, through society, the kind of solitary is turned communal, right? All right, I want to ground this and provide some actual evidence, concreteness to this talk. So I'm going to share my screen and show you all some examples of what this looks like. All right. Okay, so here are some poems, right? And what's important to kind of acknowledge, notice about these poems is they're all kind of wrestling with the truth. They're all using their individual voices to kind of chronicle, as James Baldwin, right, what pushed us to do as writers, right? So this first poem was written in 1860 by a poet named Walt Whitman. And so this is, Walt Whitman's kind of take on this ethos of the American dream, right? This is Walt Whitman's America. I hear America singing. I hear America singing. The very carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat. The deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter song, the plowboy on his way in the morning or at noon intermission or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The day, what belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths, their strong, melodious songs, right? Brilliant poem, right? Walt Whitman doing this chronicling, right? This kind of observation of song, right? What's important to note tonally about this poem, right, is that most folks usually sing when, right? When they're happy. It's a joyous occasion, right? And so what you notice in this poem is the mechanic is singing. So clearly the mechanic is happy, content, okay with the task, with his role, with this idea of America that he fits into as a mechanic. The mason is singing, right? The shoemaker is singing, right? The sewer, right? Etc. All these folks are singing, right? So there's a joy, right? The poem ends with their mouths and the strong melodious songs, right? So there's a joyous kind of a tone, right? Hopefully folks are familiar with the idea of battle rap. And if not, let me give you a quick little synopsis of what battle rap is. Basically, it's when two rappers kind of go back and forth. Usually they cap on one another, but a large part of it is kind of a conversation, right? Or it's call and response, or it's kind of making sure that each person feels the words in the language that the other has to say, right? So I have this theory, and it's not proven, but it's something that I'm working on, and that is Langston Hughes came along 60 years later in 1926 and says, I hear you, Walt Whitman. I hear about the boatman singing, the mechanic, etc. That's great. But I don't see myself reflected in those songs. I don't see myself reflected in the snapshot that you captured of this America. And so Langston Hughes came along and said, I too am America. And this is Langston Hughes' poem, which I, again, like to think of as kind of a response, right? I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. So tonally, this is a little bit different, right? Langston Hughes says, I'm the darker brother, and I'm sit to eat in the kitchen when company comes. right? But then he does what? He laughs, right? Ironically, right? Satirically, kind of in retribution, I laugh and eat well and I grow strong. And then tomorrow, which is a word that signifies newness, signifies hope, signifies something beyond our current struggle, right? Tomorrow, I'm gonna be at the table. You know, you won't be able to send me to the kitchen when company comes. And you won't be able to say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, not only will I reclaim this for myself, but you will also feel convicted. You will also see how beautiful I am and how American I am, right? How a part of this picture you painted I am, and be ashamed, right? I too am America. Walt Whitman was speaking the truth. Walt Whitman used his voice to chronicle, excavate the times, right, of America. Langston Hughes also was in search of wrestling with the truth, right? Both in vastly different ways, right? Fast forward, sometime later, right, nearly 100 years later, the only Pulitzer Prize winning person to win a Pulitzer Prize for a rap album, Kendrick Lamar, in a song called I, says this: they want to say it's a war outside, bomb in the street, gun in the hood, mob of police, rock on the corner with a line for the fiend and a bottle for the lean and a model on the scheme. These days of frustration keep y'all on tuck in rotation. I duck these cold faces, post up fee-fi-fo from bases, dreams of reality's peace, blow steam in the face of the beast. Sky could fall down, wind could cry now. Look at me, motherfucker, I smile. So Kendrick Lamar comes along, says, cool, I'm familiar with, you know, the picture that folks have painted, Langston Hughes and Walt Whitman and whoever else. Here's what it looks like for me. Here's what it looks like growing up in Los Angeles, right? Here's the snapshot of what walking down the street in the place that I call America looks like. This is Kendrick Lamar wrestling with the truth, right? So these are writers, these are poets wrestling with this idea of the truth, all right? Here's a poem by the poet Noor Hindi, which is pretty timely, called Fuck Your Lecture on Craft. My people are dying. Colonizers write about flowers. I tell you about children throwing rocks at Israeli tanks seconds before becoming daisies. I want to be like those poets who care about the moon. Palestinians don't see the moon from jail cells and prisons. It's so beautiful, the moon. They're so beautiful, the flowers. I pick flowers for my dead father when I'm sad. He watches Al Jazeera all day. I wish Jessica would stop texting me, Happy Ramadan. I know I'm American because when I walk into a room, something dies. Metaphors about death are for poets who think ghosts care about sound. When I die, I promise to haunt you forever. One day, I'll write about the flowers like we own them. 2020, right? So Noor Hindi, again, chronicling In Search of the Truth, dedicated to wrestling with the truth, writes this poem, right? There's a trend here, right? If you don't notice. A poet named Danez Smith, they wrote a poem called Less Hope. And the kind of core of the poem is that Danez Smith is super accomplished, right? Has won a bunch of awards. Books have been successful, poems have been widely published and taught, right? Danez, like the famous and great poet June Jordan, writer June Jordan, is not absolved from self-implication. June Jordan often points to herself, right? In fact, June Jordan says, sometimes I am the companion to the fire. Sometimes I am the terrorist I must disarm. In short, what June Jordan is pointing at is that what are you doing, or how are you complicit, right, in injustice? How are you complicit in the lie, right? And how are you using your platform to be in service of justice or in service of the truth? So this is a poem in which Danez Smith addresses that question, or wrestles with his own career, or their own career rather, and what that means for success, what that means to feel successful, but also guilty, right? So this is called Less Hope. Apologies. I was a part of the Joy Industrial Complex, told them their bodies were miracles and they ate it. Sold someday, made money off soon and now. I snuck an ode into the elegy, forced the dead to smile and juke. Implied America, said destroy, but offered nary step nor tool. I paid taxes, knowing where the funds go. In April, my offering to my mother's slow murder. By May, my sister filled with the bullets I bought. June, and my father's life locked in a box I built. My brother's end plotted as I spin. I don't know why I told you it would be okay. Won't. When they aren't killing you, they're killing someone else. Sometimes their hands at the ends of your wrist. You and me are agent and enemy. There I was, writing anthems in a nation whose victory was my blood. Made visible, my mother, too sugar to weep without melting. My rage, a comfort foaming at my racial mouth. Singing gospel for a God they beat me into loving. Lord, your tomorrow holds no sway. Your heaven's too late. I've abandoned you as you me. For me, c'est la vie. But sweet Satan, OG darked, kicked out the sky, first fallen and niggered thing. What's good? Who owns it? Where does it come from? Satan, first generation, mother of exile, what do you promise in your fire for our freedom? I offer over their souls. Theirs, mine, is mine. I refuse any hell again. I've known nearer devils, the audience and the mirror. I made you look weak. I clapped at my eulogies. I said encore, encore. We wanted to stop being killed and I thanked me for beauty. And pitifully, I loved them. I thanked them. I took the awards and cashed the checks. I did the one about the boy when requested, traded their names for followers. In lieu of action, I wrote a book, edited my war cries down to prayers. Oh, devil, they gave me a God and gave me clout. They took my poems and took my blades. Satan, like you did for God, I sang. I sang for my enemy, who was my God. I gave it my best. I bowed and smiled. Teach me to never bend again. So heavy poem, right? But again, that's what James Baldwin, June Jordan, Toni Morrison, and I'll share in a minute, Nina Simone wants us to do. To confront the things, even the ugly things, even the things that might not be appealing about ourselves, right? To confront those things, again, as in service of the truth, all right? I want to share one more poem and then I'll jump into some of my own poems too. This is a poem by a poet named Aracelis Girmay. It's called The Black Maria, or it's from a book called The Black Maria. This is from the actual poem, the title poem, called The Black Maria. After Neil deGrasse Tyson, Black astrophysicist and director of the Hayden Planetarium, born in 1958, New York City. In his youth, deGrasse Tyson was confronted by police on more than one occasion when he was on his way to study stars. I've known that I've wanted to do astrophysics since I was 9 years old. A first visit to the Hayden Planetarium, so I got to see how the world around me reacted to my expression of these ambitions. And all I can say is, the fact that I wanted to be a scientist, an astrophysicist, was hands down the path of most resistance. Anytime I expressed this interest, teachers would say, don't you want to be an athlete? Or don't you want to, I wanted to become something that was outside of the paradigms of expectation of the people in power. And I look behind me and say, well, Where are the others who might have been this? And they're not there. And I wonder, what is the thing along the track that I happened to survive and others did not, simply because of the forces that pretended it at every turn, at every turn. Neil deGrasse Tyson, The Center for Inquiry, 2007. Body of space, body of dark, body of light. The Skyview Apartments, circa 1973. A boy is kneeling on the rooftop. A boy who, it is important to mention here, his skin is brown, prepares his telescope, the weights and rods to better see the moon. His neighbor, it is important to mention here that she is white, calls the police because she suspects the brown boy of something. She does not know what at first, then turns with her looking his telescope into a gun, his duffel into a bag of objects, thieved from the neighbors' houses, maybe even hers. And the police, it is important to mention that statistically, they are also white, arrive to find the boy who has been turned by now into the suspect on the roof with a long black lens, which is to say, in the neighbor's mind, a weapon. And depending on who you are reading this, you know that the boy is in grave danger. And you might have known somewhere quiet in your gut, you might have worried for him in the white space between lines 5 and 6, or maybe even earlier. And you might be holding your breath for him right now because you know this story, it's a true story, though miraculously in this story, this version of the story, anyway, the boy on the roof of the Skyview lives to tell the police that he is studying the night and the moon and lives long enough to offer them, the cops, a view through his telescope's long black eye, which is, if I'm spelling it out anyway, is the instrument he borrowed and the beautiful trouble he went through, lugging it up to the roof to better see the leopard body of sky speckled with stars and the moon far off, much farther than, since I am spelling the thing out, the distance between the white neighbor who cannot see the boy, who is her neighbor, who in fact is much nearer to her than the moon, the boy who wants to understand the large and gloriously unhuman mysteries of the galaxy, the boy who, despite America, has not been killed by the murderous jury of his neighbor's imagination and wound. This poem wants only the moon in its hair and the boy on the roof. This boy on the roof of this poem with a moon in his heart. Inside my own body as I write this poem, my body is making a boy, even as the radio calls out the Missouri coroner's news, the Ohio coroner's news, 2015. My boy will nod for his milk and close his mouth around the black eye of my nipple. We will survive. How did it happen? The boy, the cops, my body in this poem, my milk pulling down into droplets of light as the baby drinks and drinks them down into the body that is his own. See it? Splayed and sighing as a star in my arms. Maybe he will be the boy who studies stars. Maybe he will be, say it, the boy on the coroner's table, splayed and spangled by an officer's lead, as if he too weren't made of a trillion glorious cells and sentences, trying to last, leadless. Remember the body's beginning, splendored with breaths turned by time into at least this song. This moment made and the mackerel soul caught flashing inside the brief moment of the body's net, then whoosh, back into the sea of space. The poem dreams of bodies, always leadless, bearing only things ordinary as water and light. Araceli Girmay, right? Speaking the truth of the story of Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? The poem is after the truth. The poet's duty, right, as an author of that poem, is in service of the truth. right? I want to share a short clip, which has nothing to do with Downey's Unstoppables.
So fresh.
This is Nina Simone.
It's 6 times longer lasting freshness plus odor protection with Downy Unstoppable.
All right.
An artist's duty, as far as I'm concerned, is to reflect the times. I think that is true of painters, sculptors, poets, musicians. As far as I'm concerned, it's their choice. But I choose to reflect the times and the situations in which I find myself. That to me is my duty. And at this crucial time in our lives, when everything is so desperate, when every day is a matter of survival, I don't think you can help but be involved. Young people, black and white, know this. That's why they're so involved in politics. We will shape and mold this country, or it will not be molded and shaped at all anymore. So I don't think you have a choice. How can you be an artist and not reflect the times? That to me is the definition of an artist.
The great Nina Simone, right? Who? So the great Nina Simone, right, says the artist's duty is to reflect the times. In other words, the artist's duty, the writer's duty, the poet's duty is to tell the truth, right? It's to chronicle, it's to excavate, and do so in the spirit of Langston Hughes, who says the moon belongs to everyone, right? And it's for chronicling. What does that mean? That means the gaze to this gorgeous thing that we all look at, right? We have to reverse or kind of turn our gaze back to the people, to the community, to the communal, and reflect the times, to tell the truth and excavate as a means of justice, as a means of righteousness, as a means of self-preservation, right? Okay, because I am as we are, which is an African proverb, Ubuntu. I'm gonna also share just a few quotes before I jump into my own poems here, all right? Audre Lorde, who's a poet and essayist, says, "My responsibility is to speak the truth as I feel it and to attempt to speak it with as much precision and beauty as possible," right? And that comes from a great book called Black Women Writers at Work, which is edited by Claudia Tate. Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein says, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." If you're a writer, if you're a poet, right, you're wrestling with language. And if that language is limited, if that language is not in service of the truth, then the world, right, is also limited, right? Nina Simone says, the artist's duty is to reflect the times, all right? I'll stop there with the talk first portion of this, and I'll share some poems to kind of wrap up. And then if there's questions or folks want to engage, we can do that in just a moment, all right? Mentioning my father early on, I'm going to start with a poem about my grandfather rather, who I spent a lot of time with towards the end of his life. He was born in 1926 and passed away in 2016. And what a life, 90 years. And what wisdom and what banks of knowledge and history someone who's, lived the earth for 90 years must have had. And so this poem is considering that, and then also just my kind of time with him. It's called Sunday in Oakland. You ask about the weather outside in an attempt to stretch our visit. And for the next 22 minutes, flaxen leaves smother the ground. The clouds are selfless, and Oakland is golden today, like all other days, because Oakland measures its weather by the number of Black bodies basking in the sun around Lake Merritt. By now, the most complicated thing you can remember of me is my name, and how it forces your tongue to press against the roof of your mouth twice before the tension in your jaw is released. It is your only exercise. Routinely, you spend your time in bed until you don't. And then, like a moment at attention, the day is as grand as your body will allow. Oxfords, where the creases excavate themselves into a groove. A pork pie crown and a shirt that you ironed collar first for your trip to refill your bag of chia seeds and other items your VA doctor recommended, mostly aimed at preservation of a body that broke in 43 during the swing of the Allies' fist. Your power chair hoist a flag that isn't red, white, and blue, but is as American as Jim Crow. And you and what's left of the 92nd Infantry clasp onto your buffaloes as if they're the only thing you've claimed as your own. It's Sunday, and if there was a day of the week to sink into yourself, it would have to be the Lord's Day, no matter your position to God. You are no exception to this rule. You sit at the edge of a bed that is also half machine and ask me to turn the TV down before, in a swift motion, you bring your legs to rest on your mattress. Their stiff landing, the last thing I hear from you, and your breathing slows, almost still. Your nasal passages soften as if rehearsing how to leave gently. And I am reminded how some stars we admire don't exist anymore. How by the time we have praised them, they've already shrapneled into God's palms. So that's Sunday in Oakland. This next poem is a true story and has a very long title, but it also has an epigraph, which I'll read first. The epigraph is from Hanif Abdurraqib, who's a poet and essayist. I am interested in what it feels like to imagine yourself as large and immovable as the sky. Here's the title. What I imagined my mother meant when she said, "You sound like one of those conspiracy theorists," after I tell her nobody should be in prison. Imagination is a possibility we don't yet have a language for. When you've been taken, you focus on the pieces that haven't. What's in front of you, she says. There's less room for possible here. What I tell my mother Sunday at dinner, the sky we look up to is larger than the world it surrounds. And we didn't have a name for heaven until we decided some people don't deserve to be there. Or Kyle Rittenhouse sitting in a bar with neo-Nazi makes him the devil or God, depending on your definition of salvation. Or my mother and I watch outside my living room window. I decide only a deity could shake a tree that big. So I decide and ask the wind to show me its palms, to check for scarring. I want to see the battle wounds, the bruised joints, buckling skin and deliverance resting on tender ankles. We once watched the earth shift against itself, as if the Cascades reconsidered their location. And I'm reminded she has witnessed possible. Not working toward liberation is suicide, I say. She leans in, hands outstretched over me, like an invocation, asking the day to end before I do. Okay, this next poem I wrote just a little bit after the January 6th events. It's called Sitting in a Worker Chair Against Floral Wallpaper in Oakland Heat. There is a portrait of Huey Newton in my church. It's Communion Sunday, and Mama has on her good shoes with the gold links. The Jackson boys are dressed to the nines, their pants starch creased and hovering above their snakeskins like halos. Huey's in a black beret, but gone anyway. What's blood without a body to show for it? In the States, what is more righteous than a gun and a spear sitting at the left hand of God on a worker chair in Oakland? Worker chair out front since before COINTELPRO bludgeoned the Panthers. We've come because it's Easter and we're hungry. Inside, Marvin Gaye's falsetto seeps in like a gentle flood, and the kitchen becomes a small Soul Train line for 12 minutes instead. All these bodies bending like prayer. Black means religion is second only to dancing. The day America stormed America, I was Black and in exile for yanking a tulip from the ground. I shouldn't have, but wanted something more beautiful to die before I did. Call it civil disobedience. Okay, just two more poems here. And this next one is a newer poem from a work in progress, and it's written in the form of a bop, which is a form invented by a poet by the name of Afua Weaver. And basically the form is in three paragraphs or three stanzas, so to speak. And it includes like a refrain or a repetition in between each of those stanzas, right? And so this poem, which is called Bop, the journalist asked Jimmy what it was like when Martin died, is in the form of a persona. And so it's written as though the speaker is James Baldwin being asked about Martin Luther King Jr. and his passing away. A quick little backstory that's important to know about Martin Luther King and James Baldwin is that James Baldwin had bought a suit to appear in a talk at Carnegie Hall with Martin Luther King just a few weeks before Martin Luther King had passed away. And so he went and got this suit, which is oversized and huge for this special event because he wanted to look good or look nice for Martin Luther King. And so he wore that same suit to Martin Luther King's funeral because he didn't have one, right, while he was there during the funeral services. So this is, again, a bop, a persona poem, and it's called The Journalist Asked Jimmy What It Was Like When Martin Died. Well, I suppose we could spend more time pretending I bought a new suit for Carnegie Hall, bought a new suit for the occasion, bought a new suit with dues from Paris. Yes, it's true. He pays a price for in America, which still leaves a balance. Well, I have a future held in the lungs of this great thundering silence, this sleeping giant. Lord, when you send the rain, think about it, please, a little. Lord, Dorothy still navigates a crowd like the devil's bullet, surrounded by saints dressed in all white. Oh yes, I weep now. Yes, I weep again. Word is, they're hurling prayers in the air, hoping something sticks. I find myself amongst this mess on the floor, staggering the fissured healing ground. Lord, there's soot all over the alabaster and they're calling it a revolution. Lord, the mule they promised us is pulling Martin's wagon to the grave. Lord, when you send the rain, think about it, please, a little. Well, I suppose the next thing to do is lie down here on this old dirt road in the path of that old sweet chariot, wishing for it to swing down and carry us home. Precious Lord, here is your song in a strange land. Lord, what does it mean to repent in despair? Lord, what does it mean to lie in repentance? I know why we are still here. I've grown weary in the wake. Lord, send the rain. All right, and then I'll end with a rendition of the story of Noah's Ark. So this is an alternative spin on the great myth, right, of the flood, and it's titled fittingly Flood. Flood. Look, Noah was short a bird and threw my ancestor in the boat instead. This is how the black swan got its melanin, how they call us unprecedented now, unpredictable even. God left the sky running and said he'd never do it again. It's always the arrogant ones that make mistakes. It's always the animal with wings trying for freedom that suffers the most. The homies don't know words like antediluvian, but could nail a jumper anywhere 28 feet in. Malik could make the metal net sound like a wind chime in a storm. Wrist raised like a Doppler. We knew the outcome by the ankle of his arm. Malik, the geometrist. Malik, the physicist. Malik, the god of rain. Once, during the playoffs, Malik hit 4 in a row. and sent the crowds to the rafters. Everyone clasping hands with the person beside them. Everyone air suspended like a held breath, which is to say, we didn't need an ark to float. Circa 1998, Victor's trembling ankles anchor him to the edge of the slide. The water waits. Imagine watching your friend attempt to take flight in search of his father. Hurt is always on the cusp in search, hurt is always in search, on the cusp in search of something tilted more towards us like Earth's axis, slow nodding to the moon. He let go and got wings. The waves teach me to surrender the way he did, crashing through the water, death nodding back, another flood. Always the wings, making ghosts of Black boys, its own kind of destruction. Once upon a time, people were stolen and dropped off in the middle of the ocean, on the coast of someone else's land, in the middle of someone else's deeper hell, and have been treading the fire since. Usually, they call a boat of people fleeing death immigrants, or if you're from South America, aliens. But some folks love a good epic, so for magical realism's sake, we'll call it a miracle. The end is a long exercise in patience. On the 40th day, Noah sent out the dove, and it came back with hope in its beak. At the vigil, we held for the migrants who didn't make it. We released the doves. They never returned. Legend has it, there's a rainbow gushing out of Grizzly Peak, East Oakland's rugged crown, drowners at its steep feet, juvenescence jigsaw piled into whichever ill-equipped ride we could negotiate, a scraper, Park Avenue, LeSabre, or other General Electric car born before we were. We ascend to find the beginning of the colors, blunts in hands. We aim to get high. We don't wait for God's generosity. We peel back the clouds. Up here, after 8 p.m., even a citywide graveyard looks like a pot of gold. I'm not saying there is a God, but we jumped into the flood without knowing how to swim and waded in the water or sifted through the cracks on the floor. In the photo, a Black boy is holding another Black boy, and out the mouth of the small one's chest is a beam. And I know no other way to compute retribution than Black folks being owed heaven and only having to say, amen, amen for it. So I'll stop there because I've talked a long time now, and I'd love to hear questions, thoughts, to just engage if there's anything folks want to share. Thank you for listening to me ramble about poems and the truth and James Baldwin for an hour. Love to hear from y'all now.
Oh my God, it was incredible. We have lots of stuff, and I will say, Catherine and I are both social scientists, and we're blown away. And we've been exchanging questions and ideas, and we know we have a whole classroom that's watching this and listening to you, and they may have questions too that Allison, if you want to be a conduit for them as well in the Q&A feature to share questions. I know we may have some more coming in. We're going to go ahead and start with what we've started to assemble from the Q&A, and we'll start taking some of those as well. So Catherine, you go ahead and get us started.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel, for the talk and also sharing so much of your work with us. This was fantastic. The first question is one we got from the Q&A, which is, who are your more recent influences and inspirations, poetry, art, or otherwise?
Oh yeah, I love it. I love how they included art and otherwise. So a lot. So I'll start by saying I engage with music quite a bit. In fact, music was one of my earlier influences and instructions on like cadence, on rhythm, on prosody. And so if you examine like my work, especially my first collection of poems, and I guess the second one too, there's conversations with music. So for example, my second collection of poems, Mausoleum of Flowers, has this through line or the suite of poems, which were in conversation with Frank Ocean's Blonde album. I think the album Blonde is one of like the greatest albums of all time. I think Rolling Stone has it like top 50. I'd have it like top 3. But anyways, I was both inspired, but also curious, right, about Frank Ocean's modulation of adolescence and like this idea of arc and growth, and spirituality and sexuality. And so as a writer, I was like, I'm going to use my poems to engage with, wrestle with what Frank Ocean is doing in this musical album, right? So music quite often, right? So Frank Ocean, Kendrick Lamar, amongst a slew of other folks, Nina Simone, Bessie Smith, a bunch of folks. But then also recent writers too. So like the homie Quentin Collins, I'm a huge fan of, and I'm always in conversation with his work. A Vietnamese poet, Ocean Vuong, is a phenomenal poet, right? And thinker in mind that I'm inspired by and in awe by. I mentioned Hanif Abdurraqib, who's another poet, an essayist, and brilliant mind. There's so many, right? My daughters. In the summertime, when I'm not really heady, I like to use my hands because it allows me to write in a different way. I like to think of writing outside of font and text. And so I take on a task every summer. So I built my daughter like a bed out of like wooden pallets. And folks are like, what does that have to do with writing? What does that have to do with poetry? Again, I think of poetry as like another way of using your hands. And so when I'm building my daughter's bed out of these wooden pallets, I'm being resourceful. As Emily Dickinson would say, I was using the available resources. And so I'm inspired and kind of taken aback by how you can make something out of virtually just the raw materials around you, right? So I'm also inspired and energized by taking on projects with my hands. I write a lot of ecrastic poems. So there's a museum on campus, so I take walks in and look at the exhibits and the art pieces and the paintings and the what have you, right? So I'm inspired by quite a bit. And I'll share one last thing, and that is oftentimes when writers are stuck writing, right, or they think of writer's block as a thing, it's usually just the body's way of saying there's another way that you need to be writing right now, and that's not on the page, that's not in front of the computer. Maybe that's taking a walk and listening to the birds, right? Or going and sketching with your daughter, because in doing so, you recognize the kind of synthesization between the task at hand and the poem and what's happening in your daughter's life or with the birds that you're listening to, right? So return to the outside, return to the communal, and that's where the inspiration for me comes from, the world and the people and the art that inhabits it.
That's really fantastic, Daniel. And actually, you kind of started to speak to this next question a little bit. I think for our students would really appreciate learning a little bit more about your process. So can you tell us a little bit about your typical writing process and maybe also a little bit about your path of how you became a published author? Because I know a lot of our students want to learn more about they're aspiring poets and writers. They want to learn a little bit more about how to become a published author and writer.
Sure. So I'll start with the latter question.
Yeah.
So I mentioned, my sister and Justin Ross and all that. So after, Mr. Ross gave me that notebook and that book, The White Boy Shuffle, all of 9th grade, I actually was the kid who would go in the field and like write poems during lunch. And the homies are like, yo, come play ball. We're down 5 and like, we need you. And I'm like, I gotta finish, this poem. So anyways, all throughout high school, it was still very much like internal. I was reserved, quiet, kid growing up. So all the writing, the poetry happened just, journals, right? And it wasn't shared at all. After I graduated from high school, I got involved with spoken word and slam poetry. And a lot of folks really don't understand that the oral actually precedes and predates the written work, right? A lot of folks like to separate like page poetry and like spoken word or like oral poetry. But if you look at ancient poetry, it was griots, right? It was, folks telling stories, reciting poetry, oftentimes lyric, accompanied by music, but it was all oral, right? And it wasn't until the printing press and like things became industrialized and folks wanted to translate information across space and time that we wrote things down, right? And poetry became a page thing, right? So anyways, after I graduated high school, I got involved with slam poetry, which for those that don't know, is like a competition for spoken word, in which you recite a poem, you have all these rules, and you're judged really arbitrarily and subjectively, and then like you can win the prize or win the slam based off of how good your poem is and how well you deliver it and all that. So what was really cool about that is it actually helped me, in addition to like getting better at like writing and poetry, it actually exposed me to different people, different styles, and it allowed me to build a community and then build connections. And so through that, I got to tour, to share my work throughout the country, to visit different colleges, different, open mic venues. And I grew really as a person, and also as a writer through doing that. After, doing that for a few years, I said, okay, I love performing, I love spoken word, but I also am interested in like how I can translate this to the page and what that'll look like on the page. And so I went to Laney College, actually, right out of high school, and I played football there. I broke my collarbone my sophomore season. And I was really disheartened after that. It didn't take me out physically, but mentally I was really like out of it. And so I actually just got a job right after Laney College. I graduated, got like an associate's degree and just got a job. In fact, I got several jobs. I was a chef. I worked at a pizzeria and just some other stuff. I was like a gym instructor for some time, just all these jobs, but I wasn't writing and I was unhappy. And so I took a trip to New York to visit Tanisha Smith, my older sister, and visited the College of St. Rose, in which I, long story short, ended up applying to that school to transfer and finish up my bachelor's degree. So I applied, got in, got some money to attend school there and finished my English degree. It was there that I was involved with the literary club on campus, and it was called the Pioneers Review. And I seen what it was like on the other side of like editing and editorial work, what it was like to craft a poem for the page, what it meant to kind of translate story via the page. I was still performing, but again, I was marrying the two things, right? And so I submitted my first ever poem to the Pioneers Review, and they got accepted. That wasn't the first poem that I submitted ever though, just as a quick little plug. It took many rejections. In fact, if you look at like my spreadsheet of rejections to acceptances, there's many more rejections than there are acceptances. So don't be disheartened by being rejected. So anyways, I submitted that, got accepted, fell in love with what the word could do on the page too, right? And so then from there, to fast forward, I applied to an MFA program in Boston, got in, was mentored by some phenomenal poets, Nicole Therese Dunn and Ian Haley Pillock, Terrence Hayes, and a few other folks. And what ended up being my graduate school creative thesis was my first book. And so I wrapped that up in my MFA program and submitted that to some presses. Now, a quick note on that really quick is if you're interested in submitting individual poems, it takes some work on the front end, right? You shouldn't just submit stuff to be published because you want to be published. You should be careful and conscious about where your work will live, because once you release it and you submit it and it's potentially accepted, it's going to now live in this other space outside of you and outside of whatever you might have intended it to be. And so you have to be careful that whatever place you submit it to upholds the same values, moral standards, stands for the same things that you're interested in. And then publishes good work and maybe folks that you admire, right? So do some research. Good way to find out about that is look at the mastheads, right? Who are the folks running these journals, these presses, these platforms? Look at the work that they've put out, previously, right? Buy an edition, buy a copy, read the journal if it's available online. Talk to folks, right? What do you think about X journal, right? And then, you can submit, and potentially have it published. Same goes with if you have a complete manuscript, right? If you're going to write a book, that book is going to now live in the world, right? And you can't control where it lives, how it's interpreted. So your best, your job is to kind of make sure that it's vetted in where it lives and who gets to, partake in it, and to be careful about, the home that it has in the world. I said a lot of stuff. Hopefully that was an answer to the question. It was about getting started with publishing, right? And submitting work. And there was another part, which is how I got started, which I mentioned, right? Okay, I
Your
think that's it.
process a little bit.
Oh, process.
You're a little bit your writing process.
Really
Yeah.
quick on the process. My process is a mess. I'll say that I used to carry around a backpack, and inside of that backpack was a ton of journals. I don't have any handy with me now, but like 10 different journals. And all that was because taking a walk, taking a shower, doing whatever, mowing the lawn, lines, thoughts, images, things would come to me, and I needed to be able to write them down.
Yeah.
So for me, sitting down and writing a poem in one sit is really tough. For me, it's actually scraps of things. And then eventually I come down, I sit down and I gather the scraps, and then I make that into a poem. Very seldomly I'm able to sit down and write a poem from start to finish. Usually it's much more of a mess, of a process, but it involves getting out into the world and again, engaging with society, community, the world. Yeah.
Fantastic. Actually, that makes me feel a lot better about writing poetry. I just could never imagine sitting and writing, especially when you read these and your work is so complicated, having all of that complication in one sitting, being able to process, that makes it so much less intimidating.
It's a terrifying experience.
Yeah.
Terrifying. Yeah.
Anyone able to do that, it makes so much sense. Go ahead, Catherine. Go ahead. You're next.
Well, wonderful. Sorry, I was all caught up in this process and thinking about not just all the different pieces that you come up with, but at some point, I'm sure there's also research you have to do to kind of figure out how it all molds together. And you had all sorts of historical examples. There's just so much that goes into each of these. It's amazing.
Yeah. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I think that's the duty too, right? Getting the truth is to do the excavation, is to do the digging, right? Is to read. To write, you have to read. And so usually that historical information comes from reading, right? And doing the diligence. In the Western world, we have this really one-directional way of looking at reading, and that is the writer does the work, publishes the thing, and then that's it. And as a reader, I'm spoon-fed. Instead, we should really think about reading as a conversation, as a two-way street in which both the writer does work, but also the reader does work too. So if there's something you don't recognize in a poem, in a text, in a novel, it's okay to have to do the research, to do the work, to figure out what that means, because that's what writing and reading should be, right? Like a two-way street in which we both engage and wrestle with a theme, right?
That is so amazing. And if I could just take that clip and put it into every single one of my classes.
Yeah, exactly.
It's actually what you just described in 20 seconds, exactly what I want my students to take away from critical reading, right? Sure. It's a dialogue with the text, right? Sure. You're engaging with the text. Sure. Brilliant.
Yep.
Okay,
so now to the actual question. So this is a big one. And I'm guessing we probably only have time for 2 more, but so there's a lot going on right now. You already, alluded to some of this. It's weighing very heavily on many of us. How can you just say a little bit about how might poetry help us to kind of respond and engage and heal, in particular when we think about that these stories might be someone else's stories, right? So how do you think about maybe trying to speak about someone else's stories in poems and writing more generally?
Yeah, I'll return back to James Baldwin, who says, you think, this is a paraphrase, but he says, you think your struggles, your triumphs, your beauties are your own, and then you read something, right? Which is to say, my liberation, my struggle, my triumph is directly tied to someone directly across the globe who I might not know, which is another way of saying writing stories is how we make sense of how we find peace, how we find solace with the things we cannot always articulate in other ways, right? So poetry is really like the distillation of language. It's supposed to be language in its most distilled version. And what that means in layman's terms is basically, the poem is both what the poem says, but the poem should also invite you to kind of explore different layers and different complexities as they relate to the rest of the world. And the beauty of that is there's different kind of ways of unpacking and connecting to, say, a poem, a story, an essay, and the hope for that, right, or the result of that is that you can find yourself in that piece of writing or in that story, so that you might find peace in it, right? Or you might learn how to deal with someone who's passed away by reading a poem, right, about somebody wrestling with the death of, their, whoever, right? And so I think stories are a way that we can kind of empathize and make sense of and connect with other people and other stories. It's probably the best way to do so, right? Because you get to understand and kind of like envision and be engulfed in another place other than your current reality. So again, about the things that are happening right now in the world, right? Writing, not only just journaling, but also trying to, again, wrestle with, there's no like right or wrong way to do it, right? It's like put a pen to paper and try to wrestle with or confront the things that are pressing on your mind, right? James Baldwin says, write about the thing that haunts you, right? So if that's what's happening in the Middle East, right, then write about that thing. And in doing so, you might not find a resolve, you might not find peace, right, quote unquote, right, but it'll help you might kind of make sense of your emotions, your thoughts, the way that you're kind of feeling in that moment. And that in and of itself, I think, is healing, right? Making sense of the world, making sense of anything, right, through writing is a healing practice. Yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
That was brilliant. I love that. There was so much today that you spoke to that really resonated with me. There are two things that I keep thinking about. One, the piece that you spoke about Emily Dickinson and the pieces of paper and of course, as I look around at you cannot see my very messy desk, and I'm like, how I sometimes will make do with what I have. And I was like, why can I not activate my inner Emily Dickinson to like now I'm like feeling like, okay, that's what this is going to be. But there's something about that I feel like resonates with me and how I see my students and our students and the work we do at the college. And then the clip that you played of not Emily Dickinson, sorry, I'm repeating myself, of Nina Simone.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge Nina Simone fan too. And I was just like, ugh, I was like, yes.
Yeah.
But the question I want to ask doesn't have to deal with either of them. It's actually something that has to deal with a little bit with what I do as a historian.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of ties a lot of what you were speaking to, and actually some of what I heard even in your work. It's about kind of what poetry has some power to do that goes even in some ways beyond the limits of the poem itself. And talking about this idea of the power of truth that comes from the duty of the poem and of the poet rather, right? You talked a lot about truth today, right? And that's really refreshing to me as a historian, because my training as a historian, we're trained to seek an objective truth. We're storytellers too, right?
Yeah.
But we're trained to like seek objective truth, right?
Sure.
One historian called it the noble dream, is to find objective truth, but dream is the emphasis, right? Is the point of emphasis.
Yeah.
So to kind of close, how do you think poets might be able to help us rethink our expectations of knowing the past?
Yeah. That's a good question. So one of the things that I usually tell my students when they're writing is that, and you all probably know this, is that memory like fails us quite often, right? In fact, my memory is terrible. But what is, I guess, unique about a poem, and here's a quick little snippet, is that if you don't always understand a poem, the same way that maybe there's a song that you really love, it makes you feel a way, or it puts you in a certain mood. A poem can do that too, and that's okay if you don't understand the poem, right? A lot of folks think of poetry as like this complex, like code to be cracked, which it shouldn't be, right? In fact, the best poems are the poems that are, again, the most distilled and use the most simplistic language, and we arrive at like the greatest image or understanding of something. Where I was going with that is that what I was saying was that, so the idea is that when you're crafting a poem, you don't always have the concreteness of fact to rely upon. Instead, what you should be after is a poem being able to move the reader in some way. So again, if you listen to a song, there's many songs that move me. Again, Blonde, Godspeed on the album Blonde by Frank Ocean, Self-Control, Nights are songs that move me, right? So I can unpack the songs and try to look at the lyrics of the songs and figure out why they move me. But I can also just listen to the song and understand that the song in its composition, right, that includes the production, that includes the vocals, that includes the sonics of it, right, that moves me in some way. The same thing can be said of poetry. And so when you don't remember the facts of a thing, it's also important, or it's important to remember how the thing might have made you feel, right? So we don't remember, again, the concreteness of something, but I do remember when I did X thing, or when I experienced X thing, I was sad. When I experienced X thing, I was furious, right? So that can come through in a poem, and that's the way that we can kind of translate and empathize to a reader via those emotions, right? So it's not through, again, the facts, the concreteness of something, but if I can translate this emotion, if I can translate this feeling, if I can translate the way, I observe the world in that moment, I think that's just as valid as, again, a number, a statistic, a factual piece of concrete evidence, right? So it's okay to feel a way about a poem, right? To feel a certain way after reading a poem, and that's just as valid, right, as understanding or analyzing the work too. I think that speaks to your question. That's the way that I interpret or think about your question.
Kind of liberate ourselves from a little bit from that kind of the rigidity and some of the, I think there's this, I think the thing that you said when you were opening this idea of memory fails us is the thing that historians are afraid of.
Yeah.
That the incident of the past, the moment the moment ends, we lose the moment. And
Right.
so historians reconstruct, and we tell the story of the past, and we retell, and the historians are afraid of the way that we as human beings have always told the past through story and song and poem, because it's not that authoritative truth that we've become more accustomed to, but actually that authoritative truth is just as false as anything, right?
Sure.
I think we're learning in the era of AI, and like maybe I am also a bot, right? We don't know.
Sure.
Who knows? But and that's actually the kind of thing that I think is like, as I'm listening to the sort of, there's something that's sort of beautiful about finding liberation in the work of poem, of a poem, and of poetry in general, right? Is the idea of the emotion and the feeling, and capturing that feeling of the moment and understanding that emotion, right? As a way to tie into the past, right? It's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think we are at our time, but this has been such a fantastic presentation and conversation. We are so thankful that you are here with us, Daniel, and everyone in the audience. Thank you for joining us. We're sure you got so much out of this presentation. And I think the last thing I just wanted to share quickly was our next flyer for our next event, which I will just put on the screen for just a minute. This is, just mark your calendars for November 8th. We will have our next speaker, Catherine H. Lee, coming to talk about Black and Asian American student activism for ethnic studies writing classes at UC Berkeley. between 1969 and 1971. So
Yeah.
we hope that you all will be able to join us for that. And again, just want to send our huge gratitude to Daniel for being with us today.
Thank you
Thank you,
all.
Professor Lee. I mean, I was thinking about Professor Summerhill. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Professor Summerhill.
Thank you. Thank you both. Okay.
Yes.
Bye.
Okay, and I will stop the recording.